It's my honor and my pleasure to introduce Mitch Morrissey, the district attorney for the 2nd Judicial District in Denver. He was elected in 2004 and twice re-elected. He's been a pioneer and leading expert in DNA in the courtroom, and he has on his website, he has a DNA resource section that has been internationally recognized as a good place to look for information DNA in the courtroom. He's worked in the Denver DA office for 20 years. He has a staff of 77 lawyers and 120 staff. Other activities that he follows are victim advocate, as a victim advocate in prevention and intervention in crime. But his leading area of expertise is DNA in the courtroom. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mitch Morrissey.
Can people hear me?
No. Not yet.
No?
A little closer to you. Can you put the mic closer to you?
Sure. Say something, Mitch.
Good morning.
That's good.
Welcome to Denver, those of you that aren't here. I'm the Denver District Attorney, so I go around the country talking, and I was in Florida a couple weeks ago and went behind a DA from Portland who said, you know, Portland is the San Francisco of the United States, of the Northwest. And then I got up and said, Denver's the Amsterdam of the United States. I'm not here to talk about marijuana. I don't want to talk about marijuana. It appears that that's all anybody wants to talk about when it comes to Colorado. So I'm glad you're here to hear about DNA. I started my career in the Denver DA's office in 1983 as an intern, and then got elected about 20 years later as the elected DA. In the late 80s, I got assigned a case, a burglar who also sexually assaulted a woman in her home. And the defense came to me and said, hey, guy's responsible for the burglaries, not responsible for the sex assault. There's this new science called DNA. We'd like to send the samples off to a private lab, because at the time, that's all there was, and show you that he's not the rapist. Of course, we had made him on fingerprints. So we had a fingerprint at the crime scene and at about a dozen other burglary crime scenes where there was no sex assault. At the time, my boss said, well, how much does this cost? And cost was always a huge thing with DNA. And actually, one of the advances is it's much cheaper than it's ever been. It was a few $1,000s, and the defense was going to share in the cost, because in Colorado, if you want, we have to cut our samples in half and save half for the defense. And I said, it's my understanding that if I send my half off with your half, the chances of getting a result are much better. That's the other thing that DNA has advanced in. We don't need as much sample as we used to have back in the 80s. So we sent our sample off, and the nice thing about Cellmark, the private lab that did the work at the time, they had a precursor test to tell you if there was enough molecular weight in the sample to be able to run the old type of DNA that we used to run in criminal cases. And they came back and said, yeah, we have enough. And at that point, the defense didn't want any further testing done. And I told my boss, I said, you know, we really can't leave this hanging. And I know we're going to have to go the expense, but we really need to know the answer. Now we've started. And so I had a great boss. I've had great bosses my entire career there. Hopefully my people consider me a great boss. I don't know. But he said, yeah, Mitch, we need to do this. And so we did. And it came back, and it matched the gentleman that was the burglar, and he was also the rapist. And then we had to go through what ended up being almost a decade in the United States, and certainly in Denver and in Colorado, of pre-trial hearings on the admissibility, the reliability of DNA, and using DNA in the criminal setting. And so I started down that road. One thing I can tell you is that most of the people that work in my profession are not doctors or something else because they don't like science. And so when you get a lawyer that starts doing this work, you pretty much become the go-to person. So throughout the 90s, I spent an awful lot of time in court with expert witnesses in biology, genetics, statistics, doing the kinds of things I always hated in school, but had to do because those are the kinds of people you talk to when you're trying to put this type of science before a jury. And so we spent almost 10 years as DNA Evolved doing pretrial hearings. And sometimes there would be scientists saying it was valid, and sometimes there'd be scientists saying it wasn't valid. So I did that too. And anytime there was a case in Denver with DNA, they came to me. And DNA evolved in our city over time, and we started doing our own work in our own crime lab in the mid-90s. And just recently, in fact, a year ago, we opened a brand new state-of-the-art crime lab in Denver. It was paid for in a bond initiative, and one entire floor of this small 4-story building is devoted to doing forensic DNA work. And forensic DNA in the last 25 years has advanced at an incredible pace. Now, I have some videos on here, and they have audio, and I don't know if we're hooked up to do that, so I may just skip them, and I apologize for skipping them. This doesn't seem to be advancing now.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Just hang on. We'll get this figured out.
I think it's when my mic gets too close to his mic.
Is this a PowerPoint?
It was frozen. Yeah, the problem is I don't think there's any audio, so if you can give me something that will just advance through it.
Put the microphone up to the speaker.
Can you put the mic up to the speaker?
You can put the microphone near the speaker.
You turned off the speaker, Ed. You've turned off the amp.
We turned off the amp.
Turned off the amp.
These bases are cytosine, guanine, gene, and protein. The sequence of the 4 bases includes genetic instructions used in the development and functioning of all known living organisms. This information is what makes up the gene. And genes, as we all know, contain the recipes for the components of life. Genes hold all the information to build and maintain an organism's cells, and they also pass genetic traits to offspring. Human DNA contains an estimated 20 to 25,000.
It's not working, is it?
No, and this is
I'm sorry.
If you go to that right-hand side and increase the volume on the computer, and then put the microphone next to it, I believe you'll have the answer.
I have the volume all the way up. I'm sorry.
On the computer?
Yeah. Is the microphone turned on?
Yeah, the mic's on.
What microphone ever go?
What?
It's
Do
on.
you have the microphone on my computer works?
Oh, this is working.
Do you want to put that on?
Don't worry.
You have an RCA jack here. You can go straight from your computer into the RCA jack.
I don't have. I don't have one.
Wow, you get your connections. Keep them in the box.
Sorry.
I want a flash drive, and I have a flash drive. I can put it on here. The microphone works. Would you like to do that?
How are we going to get it to them?
Find a 7-year-old.
You'll put the mic in front of mine.
You know, I can do this without these clips, so why don't we do that? And then we'll go from there. If they fix it, they fix it, but let's do this. So why is DNA important? You know, and what that clip talked about really is that there's DNA in everything we find, basically, that's living on the planet. And it's genetically, we inherit our DNA from our parents. And because of the uniqueness of the DNA that we find in people, in plants, in animals, we can use that to give us leads in criminal cases. And so why is DNA important in the criminal aspect? I must be pushing the wrong button. Okay. We find DNA in violent crimes. It's bodily fluids, blood, those types of things. So 90% of the violent crimes where DNA is important, women are the victims of those crimes. And those are violent crimes like murder, rape and murder, those types of things. The 10% that are left, and remember I'm talking about violent crimes, are kids. So about 9.5 are kids. So this is a science that helps people like me catch male predators who are raping and murdering women and children in our communities. That's why I believe that it's important. It's also important because it helps us get the right guy. It exonerates innocent people. We exonerate more people at the beginning of an investigation these days because of DNA than we ever did before. And I'll give you examples of that. Why is it important to you? It saves time when it comes to investigators and solving cases. Saves money, and I'll show you how it does that. And it promotes justice and prevents crime. This is an example. This is Mr. Lonnie Franklin. Mr. Lonnie Franklin is currently charged with 11 murders in South Central Los Angeles. And this is one of the most advanced uses of DNA. So we start with the most advanced and then we'll kind of go through. But you're not going to be able to hear this lady, so the next clip. Basically what happened is Mr. Franklin is the most active serial rapist west of the Mississippi River for the last 25 years. Mr. Franklin would pick up women in South Central Los Angeles. He would sexually assault them, shoot them, and dispose of them in alleys. What happened was they would run the DNA and they started to match the cases. They call him the Grim Sleeper. The media does that. They give these guys names. And the reason they gave him that name was because for a period of time he seemed to stop. And what happened is they did advancements in DNA. They started to match all these cases together. And once they started matching these cases together, then they matched the ballistics. He used the same gun. And you can match ballistics just like you can fingerprints in the work that I do. But Mr. Franklin never got into the California database. The California DNA database has over 1 million people in it currently. It is the third largest DNA database on the planet. Second is the UK, and of course, first is the US DNA database, which has over 10 million people in it. And a big portion of that is California. Mr. Franklin was able to commit these crimes and never do anything that qualified him to go into the DNA database. And so the frustration that you have is when you tie these cases together, you know you've got the same guy, you put the profile into the database and you don't get a match. So what do? You just sit and wait. But that's not what California did. California actually started a familial search policy program, and they took a software that allows you to look for relatives that is in your large database. And what they were able to do is when Mr. Franklin's son went into the database for a gun charge, he got convicted. They got a familial match to Mr. Franklin, which meant they had a lead. They still needed Mr. Franklin's DNA. So the LAPD, with some detectives, followed Mr. Franklin around. And when Mr. Franklin went in a pizza restaurant and finished eating, he left. And instead of the staff bussing the table, the LAPD bussed the table, and off of a fork and crust, they got Mr. Franklin's saliva. They matched Mr. Franklin to their unsolved murders. Mr. Franklin is currently charged with first-degree murder of all of these women from South Central Los Angeles.
Next slide.
Next slide. You can see it. Yeah, close.
Police in Los Angeles today announced the arrest of a retired auto mechanic they say haunted the city for a quarter century. A serial killer who allegedly preyed on the weak. As Neil Karlinski reports, they may have his son's DNA to thank.
The killings took place in a cluster around the same South LA neighborhood. All of them matched to the same .25 caliber handgun. All of them matched to the same DNA, generally saliva taken from the victim's breasts. Most of the killings occurred before 1990, and police wouldn't have had a clue they had a serial killer on their hands, if not for the fact that he started killing again. After a 14-year break, the Grim Sleeper awoke to kill 3 women in 2002, 2003, and 2007.
Well, here we have 12 individuals starting in 1985. Our third victim, Thomas Steele, was the only male involved in this.
What's common to the victims?
They're all from the same general area of the city in South Los Angeles. I don't think I would label them all as prostitutes per se, but they certainly are have troubled lifestyles. They're broken people, and they're easy targets.
The arrest was a long shot even by cold case detective standards. Because the suspect was clean, he had no DNA to match as part of a massive million-sample sweep of the state's felon database. Enter a technique called familial DNA. When the suspect's son was reportedly arrested in another matter and swabbed for DNA, detectives were blindsided by what they say was a partial match linking back 2 decades to the Grim Sleeper case. That link from a son to his father broke the case.
It's the tenacity of these detectives in conjunction with the assistance of technology, i.e. DNA, that got them to the end of this road.
And
No, okay.
that, I do this without my.
Try it now.
Okay. And that is a good example of what DNA does. It gives you a suspect or a link or somebody to go talk to, but it doesn't answer the question. If you're a fan of CSI, DNA is the magic bullet, right? It's not. It requires conventional investigation and good investigators that know what they're doing. Because oftentimes DNA will lead us to somebody that left their DNA innocently somewhere. So just having DNA is not enough. Not having DNA can be a real problem when you have somebody like Mr. Franklin. I don't believe Mr. Franklin ever stopped. I just think he didn't leave his DNA during certain periods of time. And Mr. Franklin's been linked since that slide to another 6 murders in South Central Los Angeles, which they are holding back and not charging him with currently. But I guess they're going to see how the first trial goes. Go ahead. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. And let's just kind of go back to the basics as far as what DNA is. So we begin with DNA collection, and somebody was going to ask me about chain of custody. Obviously, if we're going to use DNA in a courtroom, we've got to make sure it's collected properly at the beginning, and that the chain of custody, which means everybody that touches it and however it's stored, there's a record kept of that. And of course, we use the same techniques, the evidence tapes. You see the markers that they use. We mark the items. Anytime anybody touches it, they take notes. It's not nearly as romantic or exciting as they show on CSI. It's a lot of just writing, documenting, that type of thing. The other thing I always tell jurors, if they love CSI, I say, I'm going to call some forensic scientists in this case. They don't look anything like the people you're used to seeing. But they do a phenomenal job for us here in Denver and in most places across the United States. These are the kind of samples that we're looking for. We're looking for blood. We're looking for sperm. We're looking for saliva. Anything that's going to have nuclear DNA in it or DNA. So one hair with a root, and if it's forced out of somebody's head, it's going to have skin cells, skin tags with it also. That's going to be enough now to do a DNA and get a DNA profile. Back in the case I was telling you about that I started with, you wouldn't even attempt it with one hair. As long as you have the root and some skin, or just the root, potentially you're going to get a nuclear DNA profile out of that. Anything that has cells that have nucleuses in them, we're looking for nuclear DNA. There are there's other kinds of DNA, and I will talk to you about that as we go. So we inherit it it's genetically inherited. It's in all of our cells except our red blood cells. It is the same with identical twins. The fingerprint guys always say, hey, have you gotten that identical twin thing straightened out yet? Because identical twins don't have the same fingerprints. So they call themselves the true identity forensic science, because you can't currently sort out identical twins. And you'd say, well, you don't see that very often. We just in Colorado have six sets of identical twins in our DNA database. So when you have an identical twin come up in your investigation, what do? You alibi one of them. In other words, you find out where the one was, and that gives you the other one. So if one is at work and you can prove it at the time of your rape or your murder, then you've got your suspect. Again, another good example of how DNA may give you, in that case, two suspects, and you have to do a good conventional investigation to determine which one of those people that it is. It's referred to as the blueprint of life. It's interesting that DNA is very simple. It's 4 base pairs. In fact, when they originally found it, they said, this is just too simple. It can't be that important. The proteins and the enzymes and those types of things have to really be the building block of life. But it's turned out that it is just those 4 building blocks. That is the blueprint of life as they've evolved with DNA. One thing that's important is that if I leave blood at a crime scene and a policeman takes a sample from me of my saliva, my DNA is going to present itself the same way, no matter what sample it is coming from. Now, we do have people that get blood transfusions. Sometimes you'll see both people's DNA there. People that have had bone marrow transplants, you hope, because of cancer and those kinds of things, that the donor's DNA takes over and the cancerous DNA goes away, but sometimes you might see 2 different people's DNA in one single reference sample. But the good thing is that doesn't happen very often. So this is kind of how we look at it. Skin cells is an example, and you can just go through these. Keep on going. So we're going here, and we're going to the nucleus of the cell. The other DNA that I want to tell you about is mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is found in the egg outside the nucleus of the cell. And so when the egg splits, the mitochondrial DNA goes with it. The only person that gives you your mitochondrial DNA is your mother. We all have the mitochondrial DNA of our mothers. I'm not a woman, so I cannot pass my mitochondrial DNA on to my offspring. My wife gives them the mitochondrial DNA. The one thing I can pass is my Y chromosome type. I inherited that from my father. It comes from the sperm cell. The Y chromosome is the same from generation to generation unless there's been mutations. So my dad and I have the same Y chromosome. My son and I have the same Y chromosome. That helps us also in forensic DNA. But they're not used as much. And they don't discriminate as much. So you don't get a match, this is the person. You get, this may be the person, they have that type, but there may be a lot of males that have that Y type that could possibly be your suspect. Most famous situation of that is probably that line of DNA testing that was done on the descendants of Thomas Jefferson, and they did that through Y chromosome testing. The problem with saying that Thomas Jefferson was the father of that line of slaves was that Thomas Jefferson had a brother who had that same Y chromosome that lived near the plantation, and he had two sons that had the same Y chromosome. So you can say that there is a line of folks that have the same Y chromosome as Thomas Jefferson, but that doesn't answer the question if Thomas Jefferson is the father or not. It could be anybody in that paternal line that was alive at the time and could be responsible for fathering children. Go ahead. So you get half from your mom, half from your dad. 99.5% of our DNA is the same. It's what makes us people. Gives us 10 fingers, 10 toes, 1 head, those kinds of things. We all have that. So almost all of our DNA is the same. It's that is not the same is what makes us unique, and it's what we look for in forensics. Go ahead. Go ahead. So it's coming from your mom, it's coming from your dad, and so at each location we look, we should find 2 pieces of information. If we find 3, we probably have somebody with a genetic disease. Sometimes you inherit the same piece of information from your mother and your father, and the way this presents forensically is a peak height. You should have 2 peak heights. But if you get the same information from your mother and your father, you're going to have twice as high, but you're only going to have 1 because they're going to present at the same location. And I'll show you those peak heights in a minute. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and what we do in forensics is we have 13 base places that we go and look. And the idea is that they have to be inherited independently in order to figure out the statistical aspect of what we do. So they specifically selected markers that are on different chromosomes that are inherited independently. And that independence allows you then to get the statistic that we use in court on how rare the DNA profile is in the U.S. population. If you've ever been on a jury and heard a DNA expert testify, they will say, I found a match. Well, what does that match mean? Well, you have to do a statistical calculation. So what they do is they look at each marker that they found. What is the frequency of that marker in the U.S. population? Since it's inherited independently, they multiply the frequency for each marker that they find. So there's 2 at the first location multiplied. And they multiply all the other markers. And that's how we get these numbers. What are the chances of finding someone randomly in the U.S. population with this DNA profile? And it's some astronomical number like 1 in 100 quadrillion, something like that. And at a certain point, they have studied what that means, and the DNA analysts then say, based on that statistic, what can you say? That's his DNA, in my expert opinion. And so it's really a 3-pronged thing when we present. We want to show the jury the match, so they understand it matches, and it doesn't match probably the victim, or of course the victim. And you want to show her profile and show there is no match. And then You show the match. What does the match mean statistically? And usually most jurors, those kind of numbers don't mean much to them. And then, can you testify within a degree of scientific certainty whose DNA this is? And your DNA analyst will then identify the individual. For me, the best case scenario is when the bad guy has the victim's DNA on him and the victim has his DNA on her, and it's usually a her. And that's the best because you get the unique mark, the identification of your victim, and the identification of your suspect. And that's usually as good as it gets as a prosecutor. Go ahead. This is the STR system. This is what we used. When I talked to you about the old system, it was called RFLP. And what RFLP lacked that the STR system lacked was the ability to take very small amounts of DNA, as low as 8 cells, and actually copy it, amplify it. Copy it just like a copying machine. And so this is the process that we have. One, we get the biological sample. You have to extract the DNA. So if it's blood, you extract the DNA from the cells. Once you have the DNA, then you put it through the amplification process, and I'll talk to you about that. But once you have billions of samples of the DNA that you're interested in, you then size it. And the way we size it's pretty simple. We run it through a machine with a very fine capillary filter with a laser in it. And, it's just like those tubes at McDonald's. If you shoot a real small kid through it, it gets through it fast. You put somebody that's on a pretty steady diet of McDonald's, an adult, they're going to have trouble getting through the tube, right? So that's what we do. It's electronic. You shoot it through, and it sizes it. So the smaller pieces get through first, the bigger pieces, and we have ladders. We have known ladders for each type. And as it runs through, it goes past a laser, and it's tagged, and that's what causes the peak height at that particular location. And so this is all electronic. This is all done by machines. We use more and more robots than we ever did. When you use robots, it means you handle it less, which means you contaminate it or potentially contaminate it less. So right now we run plates of samples 200 at a time. That's the other advancement in DNA. We used to wait months for one sample's results. We'd pay a lot of money and take a lot of time. Now in Denver, if we have somebody kill somebody or rape somebody and the police chief determines that he wants a DNA profile out of that case, he can get it as quickly as 24 hours. Sometimes it's as fast as these machines will work. Now the other thing that happens at the end in analyzing the data is you have to have experts look at what you have. Because in forensics, unlike medicine, we only get one shot usually because we don't have an endless source. If I was taking DNA from you for some kind of medical test and I screw up the test, I go back to you and take another sample. We find a very small blood stain at a crime scene, we may have only one shot. We can't go back because we don't know who did it, right? So that's your one shot. And sometimes we do such small samples that they are actually eliminated. We have to test the whole thing. And legally, we have to deal with that issue. So it's faster, we can do smaller amounts, but it has to be interpreted. The other thing about forensic DNA, unlike the medical side, the DNA I take from you for a test is going to be one sample, one source. Forensics could be 2 people, could be 3 people. We have to deal with mixtures. And there's been a lot of work done on the interpretation of mixtures. Think about a rape case. We're going to get the victim's DNA, right? We take it off her skin. We do a rape kit examination. We find sperm. We're going to find a mixture. And we have to, in forensics, be able to deal with mixtures. And that's where the analyst comes in with the data. This is what a profile looks like. So you can see there's 3 locations on the top blue line there, and you can see the peak heights that are presented there. That looks like one person's DNA to me because there's 2 peak heights at each location. If there were 2 people in there, this is a test. How many would we expect to see? 4, possibly 3. But a tall one, right? Because the 2 pieces of information are at the same location. And we have an example of that on the green line. You can see those where there's only 1 peak height. So let's move on. That's what it looks like and is presented. So many evidence samples prevent very small amounts of DNA. So I talked to you about the amplification stage. Go ahead. About 1985, the polymerase chain reaction was invented. The man that invented it won the Nobel Prize, and it's really the basis of almost all DNA work that's done now. It's used as a core basis. He got $1 million for winning the Nobel Prize, but he basically invented a multi-billion-dollar mechanism. If he got paid just $1 every time that his systems were used, he'd be a much wealthier man than he is today. But let me show you how it works.
Polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, uses repeated cycles of heating and cooling to make many copies of a specific region of DNA. First, the temperature is raised to near boiling, causing the double-stranded DNA to separate or denature into single strands. When the temperature is decreased, short DNA sequences known as primers bind or anneal to complementary matches on the target DNA sequence. The primers bracket the target sequence to be copied. At a slightly higher temperature, the enzyme Taq polymerase, shown here in blue, binds to the primed sequences and adds nucleotides to extend the second strand. This completes the first cycle. In subsequent cycles, the process of denaturing, annealing, and extending are repeated to make additional DNA copies. After 3 cycles, the target sequence defined by the primers begins to accumulate. After 30 cycles, as many as 1 billion copies of the target sequence are produced from a single starting molecule.
So it's like a copy machine. 1 page, put it on, 50 copies, hit the button. A little more complicated than that. The nice thing about this, though, is it happens in 1 test tube. And as they heat and cool it, all the 13 markers, or if you're looking at 20 markers, happens at the same time. They have created it as a system that allows you to do that. One of the things you have to really be concerned with, though, is if you have created now billions of copies of your DNA, you've got to be careful that you don't contaminate your lab, contaminate other samples, that type of thing. So our lab is kind of like a horseshoe. They look for the evidence, they look for the stains in one side, that's the biology side. And they'll do some testing to see if it's blood, that type of thing, conventional testing. They take it across the hall into the amplification room. That's where the robots are that amplify it. And then they slide it through this door thing. They open it up. It's really technical, my description. They open it up, they put the trays there, and then you can't get into that but for on the other side of the room where they take it in. That's the post-amplification room, and that's where they run it through the machine and get the peak heights. And the nice thing about our new lab now, they go and do their work as far as the interpretations, writing their reports, all of that, somewhere completely out of the lab, which was a big issue with our old lab, because they used to office in the lab, which potentially caused all kinds of problems. Yes, sir?
So you're really amplifying that less than half of 1% that's different.
Right.
Not everything. Okay.
It's seeking out, the primers are seeking out those particular places that we're looking for. The nice thing about that is there's a lab in Ohio, they're doing the same thing. There's a lab in Canada, they're doing the same thing. We look at the same markers almost throughout this hemisphere. The Europeans actually look at some different markers, But what you have to have a database is a uniform group, at least a core group of markers. In the United States, that core group of markers is 13. And some labs do 20, some labs do more. The more you do, the more discrimination that you get. If we did all of your DNA and we looked at one site of all the people in this room, probably an awful lot of you would match at one site. Some would fall off at 2 sites. More would fall off at 3 sites. If we look at 13 sites, any identical twins here? If there's no identical twins in the room, you're going to drop off, and there'll be just one person. And it may not take that many cycles to do that. But it's a uniform group that we look at. I already talked to you about the YSTRs, and again, that's the male. You specifically go to the male chromosome, the Y chromosome, and you type it. And you use the exact same STR system to type it. Mitochondrial is done through sequencing. It's not done in most crime labs. The FBI provides mitochondrial testing in about 4 different labs in the country. If you want to wait a long time, send it to the FBI and get back mitochondrial results. We don't use mitochondrial DNA very often in Denver. Maybe if you only have bones with no bone marrow, that might be a time when you have to use mitochondrial DNA. But again, it's only going to link somebody through their maternal line. Go ahead. This is the CODIS database. This is one of the major forensic databases we use in law enforcement. The other 2 are the fingerprint database and the ballistics database. The CODIS database, which is the combined DNA network system, is the only truly national forensic database in the country. It's interesting, it's controlled by state statute. So in Colorado, our DNA database statute is different than Wyoming. We take a different group of people that qualify into the database. The way that they developed this database was let the states control who goes in. And then at the umbrella is run by the FBI. The main places in West Virginia. Why federal things are in West Virginia probably has to do with Senator Byrd more than anything else. But it is there. It's a cable. It's a completely controlled, secure database. There's never been anybody break into it, and if you do break into it, you get a bunch of numbers. The names are not there. There's nothing to identify that. So you just get a bunch of DNA profiles, which basically are just a bunch of numbers. No one's bothered to hack into this system. It's never been done. Go ahead.
In the database, both at the state level and at the national level, are known convicted offender samples, which are part of the CODIS system, the Combined DNA Index system, as well as unknown profiles that are developed for cases worked by state and local laboratories around the United States. So a local laboratory, through their state DNA index system, is capable of then searching the entire country for not only against known offender profiles, but also unknown offender profiles that have been developed in casework. So not only can we link cases to each other, but we can link cases to suspects. If there is no known suspect in the case, that search may take anywhere from weeks to months to years in order to find the individual who is responsible for committing the crime.
It's not because the search takes a long time, it's because the individual's not in the database. What he's saying there is that you're waiting for the person to get into the database to make the match. When he's talking about case-to-case matches, obviously those are important because then law enforcement can share the conventional evidence or clues that they have. We had a guy in Fort Collins, he started raping women. We knew it was the same guy because of his DNA. It matched a series of rapes in Philadelphia and a murder. And so the Philadelphia Homicide Unit and the Fort Collins Police Department started working together. And they sent items, pictures of items that they had from their suspect and got recognized, they got put on TV and recognized by citizens, and it helped lead to the individual that was responsible for those crimes, who was never in the DNA database. But it was because those cases linked that they were able to work towards solving those cases. So the Denver Police Crime Lab is a local lab. All they do are forensic cases. They don't do any databasing. They have a CODIS hookup that then provides up to the state level, which is the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. They have both forensic samples they do for the rest of the state. Denver does about 26% of the violent crime in the state of Colorado, and then the lab for the state does the rest of the state. And they may then match cases from different cities, different areas of Colorado and Denver. But they also do the convicted felons and arrestee side of the Colorado database. So they have the responsibility for the known people there. And in Colorado, we take DNA upon arrest and filing, and then you go into the DNA database. 85% of our hits come from the state database. In Colorado, it's a big state. There aren't a lot of cities. Our criminals have a tendency to stay home. So 85% of our hits are there. I mean, where are you going to go? East St. Louis, Los Angeles, Vegas. So most of our folks stay put, and most of our hits come in our state database. But we have had a number of very significant hits at the national level. Smaller states back east, people can move around a little bit more, probably have a little bit higher percentage of hits on the national database. When you can drive through a state in an hour, people can move pretty quickly. So how has DNA impacted the law? And it's changed statutes. Because of DNA, we've seen changes in statutes. This whole database, those statutes have grown up. It helps us when the victim can't ID. Used to be when I'd file a case, it's like, well, can the victim ID? No, I couldn't file it. Now the victim can ID, potentially, but DNA gives us the ID aspect of it. The other thing, and if you looked at that Lonnie Franklin tape, oftentimes our victims are broken people. We take our victims as we find them. Serial rapists and serial murderers tend to victimize women that may be out on the street, prostituting themselves. They may be drug addicts. They are in positions where they are easy prey. The serial murderers that I've prosecuted in this city have primarily chosen women that they can easily get their hands on. And if they're walking down one of our streets in the middle of the night, they're a target. Jurors don't understand that lifetime style sometimes. But if you have DNA, that gives those victims credibility. And if you can tie those cases together and show the same MO, then a jury is listening to not one murder, but 2 murders, or 3 murders in one case, or maybe 8 rapes in one case. And I got to tell you, as a prosecutor, if you're presenting 3 murders to one jury and showing the same guy did it, your chances of losing are almost 0. And that's what DNA does for us too, is it strings these cases together, it shows us a common MO, and most of the time, judges will let us try these cases to one jury. And so that's the fact. It supports the credibility. Now there is some degree of reconstruction that you can do with DNA. I had a man, he murdered his grandmother, broke into her home, killed her in the kitchen, beat her to death with wine bottles. Bottles, glass, blood. You can imagine what this crime scene looked like. She was dead in the kitchen. She didn't move from there. But as he moved through her house with her blood on his hands, he left her blood as he went through the house. He also cut himself as he was beating her with these bottles. So we started to see a mixture present itself in these stains throughout the house. In the very last place where we found blood was in a closet on her purse, and it was only his blood. By that time, her blood had dissipated off his hands. He was looking for her car keys. He came over to steal her car, and when she wouldn't give up the car, he killed her. But DNA showed us exactly the trailhead he took after he committed this horrendous murder. We caught him in Florida driving her car. Go ahead. So there's some cutting-edge applications that we have in Colorado. We obviously, it's important. This is a two-edged sword. You got to live with the DNA. If you have a good suspect and the DNA tells you it's not the guy, you have to let him go. If you have somebody in custody that's serving a long sentence for a crime they didn't commit, you want a prosecutor that's willing to let them go. So when we became aware that, that there's been about 300 people exonerated in the United States, when we became aware of some federal money that was available to put together a innocence project or a justice review type project, we did that. And our agreement was with the state attorney general. They would look at all the cases, the murders, the rapes. It was a limited number of types of crimes that the feds would let you review. So they agreed to do the rest of the state of Colorado, and we agreed to do Denver. And Denver's, 26% of the violent crime. So we took a quarter of the work, and they did the rest of the state. And we put together a group that made a decision if testing was going to be done or not. So in that first round, we looked at over 5,000 cases. Those were individuals that were in our penitentiary system that potentially could have been exonerated by DNA. We found one, Mr. Dewey.
Dewey was sentenced to life in prison in 1996 for the rape and murder of J.C. Taylor in Palisade. New DNA evidence has exonerated him. Dewey's case was reviewed by the DNA Justice Review Project, an effort led by the Colorado Attorney General's Office and the Denver DA. A federal grant of $1.2 million is paying for the review of 5,100 cases of forcible rape, murder, and manslaughter. Dewey's case happened to be one of those 5,100.
This project was about going back and looking.
So the thing that was important in Dewey's case was that the prosecutors at the time knew Dewey didn't leave the biological samples. They believed Dewey was there with another man who raped the victim and killed her. So they said to us, well, we don't really care if you do DNA because we know it's not going to match Dewey. He didn't have the same blood type back at the time. So we're going to exonerate him, even if you prove it's somebody else's DNA. My thought process was, okay, Dewey's friend's still out there, right? Let's run this DNA and see who left the DNA. So we got a match to a murderer out of Fort Collins. The guy who broke into women's houses and murdered them at home. And that's a lot like what happened in this case. And now the DA had a dilemma. If his theory is they were friends and helped each other, show that Dewey knows Thames, who was the murderer that we matched. And they couldn't do it. And they exonerated Mr. Dewey, which was the right thing to do. And they've charged Mr. Thames, which I believe is the right thing to do as well. But it was an interesting situation to have a DA say to you, well, we really don't care if you run the DNA or not. Well, yeah, you run the DNA because you might match the person. In those 300 exonerations, there's a percentage of those that there is the real person in the database that they've matched. And when you're talking about victims, and certainly victims and victims' families that have been through the legal process and the wrong guy got convicted, you owe them answers. And if you get the real guy, then you move forward and prosecute the real guy, and your state writes a large check to the wrong guy. And Mr. Dewey did get a check. The interesting thing was that Mr. Dewey really didn't qualify for any kind of wrongful because they presented the evidence they had. And the jury that convicted him knew that his blood type was different. They put what they had in front of the jury convicted him. And they didn't hide anything. There was none of this problems that you've seen in some of these other exonerations. But the key to an exoneration is that if you don't have a hit, now you have a cold case. And you've torn open those wounds again, and it's time to get busy to try to solve those cases. And that's what we've done, and we were lucky in doing. Go ahead. The other thing that it's done is we file cases now based on the DNA profile. People of the state of Colorado versus John Doe with this DNA profile. What that does is it allows us to have a case and stop the statute of limitations from running. Primarily where we use this is where we have crimes that we have DNA, where we have a short statute of limitations. Burglary. So if somebody breaks into a home, cuts themselves going in, bleeds in the house, and they're not in the database, we file the case under their DNA profile, and we wait until they get in the database. Statute of limitations is told when you file the case. Now, rape, the statute of limitation is 10 years. Murder, there is no statute of limitations anywhere in the United States. Now, with the change in the law, in a sex assault, if you use DNA, there is no statute of limitations. Another place where DNA changed the law, at least in this state. Go ahead. So another thing that we've done is we developed a cold case project. Again, we based it on federal grants that we were eligible for. We had a lot of DNA in freezers, and we wanted to get that out, to get that backlog done, and try to solve cold cases. Go ahead. One more. So we had about 5,500 cases. Over 1,000 have been sent to the lab. We've tested about 863. It's probably a little more today than it was when I put this together. Analyze now. Remember, a case is going to have more than one sample, so 1,300 samples. Submit them to CODIS. We have a 50% hit rate when we put a DNA profile from this cold case program into CODIS. We filed 102 cases to date, murders, sex assaults on kids. That's twice as many as anywhere in the world because we did sex assaults. A lot of places just did murders. Of that group, the bulk are sex assaults. But what we did do, we collaborated, communicated with our lab and our police department. We did training, and we're the most aggressive, successful cold case program in the world. Mr. Glasser is an example of one of the individuals that we caught. It was a kidnapping sex assault that went unsolved. And the reason it went unsolved is because the rape kit from that case was sitting in a freezer. And once we got it out of the freezer and we ran it, we got a match to Mr. Glasser, who was in the database for raping 2 other women. Mr. Glasser got 90 years in prison. We've had situations where we'll get a hit. Well, where is the guy? Well, he's in prison. Well, that's good. It let us put our case together. When does he get out? He gets out next week. Get the case put together. We've developed interrogation techniques around DNA. The police, the investigators, go into these investigations and these interrogations with much more ammunition than they used to when I started. They'll have a picture of the victim. They'll have a picture of the place that it took place. And they don't just say, hey, I got a DNA profile. Explain it to me. They say, have you ever been in this part of Denver? No, I've never been. How about this house? You ever been in this house? No, I've never been in this house. Do you know this woman? No, I don't know this woman. Well, then you've never had sex with this woman. No, I've never had sex with this woman. Then they talk about the DNA. And the guy either stops talking or confesses. Or maybe will tell you that it's consensual once, but he's already seen a picture and says he doesn't know the woman. So Mr. Glasser's a scary guy. Mr. Glasser had a psychosexual evaluation done on him when he went to the penitentiary on one of the older cases before we got ours. And in that psychosexual evaluation, he said he had raped over 1,000 women. He said that he used to work at a mortuary and that he would have sex with the females that they would bring in when they were preparing them for burial. And he also said on occasion he would have sex with his family pets. So he was a guy that we wanted off the streets, And actually, when we tried him, was on bond because the court had reversed his other convictions, and he was actually walking the streets of Denver when we tried him. There was a team of our police department that was following him because he's the kind of guy we knew would rape somebody if given the opportunity to. See, serial rapists, I've talked to some of them, they will admit that within an hour of getting out of prison, getting back to Denver on the bus, they'll rape a woman. That's the kind of offenders we're dealing with. This is our serial offender program. The first 70 cases we filed, every single one of those individuals had at least one contact with law enforcement for another rape. So we have taken a lot of really bad predators off the streets of Denver with this program. We've also caught murderers, again, sex offenders. This is the oldest. It goes back 30 years. We just filed our 100th case about a week ago that happened 3 days before Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated. That what tells you what era we're in trying to solve these cases. This was a young waitress that was found raped and murdered in 1980 in her car. She'd been stabbed to death and raped. We pulled the evidence, and that's the key. You got to have the evidence. When we found her old rape kit, we ran it. We got a match to Mr. Elias. Mr. Elias had come to Denver on parole, failed, and gone back, and that was the only connection to Denver we could show, and that was in the time frame that this young girl was murdered. We went out and talked to him. He denied knowing her. We brought him back. I think it was from Oklahoma, where he had collected about another 13 felony convictions, and were able to convict him. And when you talk to the mother of somebody that's waited 30 years to find out what happened to their daughter, which happened to me in that case, it is some of the most rewarding work that you do. And it's rewarding for the DNA analysts, it's rewarding for the police officers, and it's rewarding for the prosecutors. And hopefully it closes a door and helps the family some. With the rapes, many of the victims tell us they've been looking over their shoulders for almost 10 years, wondering if he's going to come back and attack them again. We've had it where they've come back and attacked the victims again. But once we catch them and they see that we hold them accountable, then then that puts them a little more at ease. So we got asked by the federal government, you think you could solve burglaries with DNA? We'll give you $500,000 to study that. I said, I can answer that question in one word. Where's the check? and they said, no, you got to keep better stats than that. So what we did for 2 years, we kept cases that we didn't run DNA and cases that we did. And we were interested in serial or professional burglars, guys that commit 200 to 250 burglaries a year. Why? Because we knew if we reduced the burglary rate significantly in Denver, when the money ran out from the feds, we could convince the city to keep doing the project. We kept even better stats than the feds wanted us to, because we wanted to make a case for keeping this program alive and continuing to do DNA. And quite frankly, the home insurance industry should fund this program because of the savings that we saw. For every dollar the feds gave us, we saw a return of $90 to the police department and to the lack of the loss of the things that were being stolen by these individuals. We're able to reduce the burglary rate 11% a year for the first 2 years and 40% in 4 years. And these are some of the guys that we caught. Mr. Davis was a 13-time convicted felon that came to us from another state. All he was here to do was pull burglaries and do drugs. He pulled, I don't know how many burglaries, but we made him on DNA in 5 of those cases, and we have good detectives here. When you give them the name of somebody that's working in their district, they look at pawn slips. They do all kinds, maybe run a fingerprint that didn't hit, those types of things. We were able to make him on another 7 cases that he was responsible for. Went to trial because he's an habitual criminal. Under our 3-strike statute, he got 48 years in the penitentiary. Unfortunately, we couldn't get him housed at the state that sent him to us. That would have been nice for those of you that are from California or from Colorado. I think he was from Missouri. One of the cases, actually, we got him on. Homeowner was there down in the basement. He came up. Homeowner came out of the basement with a wrench and hit Mr. Davis in the head. And that's how we got our DNA. But he didn't hit him hard enough to knock him unconscious. They got into a fight. And Davis bled all over his floor during the course of the fight. And we were able to catch him. This guy, I just love this guy. He breaks into a house. He must have been hungry. He opened the refrigerator. He took a bite out of what I think he thought was chicken salad or tuna salad. Didn't like it and spit it back on the plate. And put it back in the refrigerator. So he should have probably just left his Department of Corrections ID on the plate with his picture. And we were able to successfully prosecute him. And these two were really the all-stars. They were killing us in a neighborhood called West Wash Park in Denver. And we had an incredible number of burglaries. And the people there, in a very angry public meeting that I went to, thought they had been invaded by an army of burglars. And I told them, listen, we got a DNA hit on a couple on one cigarette. And I think they may be your army of burglars. When we took these two off and they were a husband-wife team, smoked the same cigarette, left it at one burglary scene, we reduced the burglary rate in West Wash Park by 40%. Mr. Weller testified in Miss Weller's trial that he was the burglar, she wasn't. All she did was pawn the items, but they were both habitual criminals. And he proudly boasted that he had pulled 1,000 burglaries in less than a year in that neighborhood because he'd been in prison before that. So we kind of saw that as a Lifetime Achievement Award. He got 48 years in the penitentiary, and she got 36 years in the penitentiary. And the people in West Wash Park were happy that we had a program. One of the things you've probably seen recently is that the United States Supreme Court ruled on taking DNA upon arrest. Colorado is one of the states that does that. Go ahead. One more. If you do this too fast, you get sick. It's like if you get motion sickness. But there are 28 states in the United States, and the federal government on federal felonies takes DNA upon arrest. The question was, is that a violation of the Fourth Amendment or not? Go ahead. This is the reason you do it. Mr. Lawless. Mr. Lawless, when I got elected DA back in 2004, was the serial rapist that was really hitting a lot of places in Denver and in Aurora. 6 rapes, 5 kidnaps, 3 robberies, 1 burglary, and some attempted rapes. That could have been prevented if we had had an arrestee statute at the time. Because what happened with Mr. Lawless, not only was he a rapist, but he was also a forger. He got arrested for forgery in 2004. And his DNA was not taken at that time because our statute didn't allow it. He pled guilty to forgery in 2004. But he didn't go to the penitentiary, because you don't go to the penitentiary for forgery in Colorado. He got probation. And he successfully completed the probation. And at the time, our statute required you to go to the penitentiary. So he was under the supervision of the Denver Probation Department while he was raping women in Aurora and Denver. And those crimes that could have been prevented would have been prevented if we would have taken his DNA upon arrest. And he got convicted. He got charged and convicted. So under our current statute, there would have been no issue with Mr. Lawless getting, and that's how DNA saves you money. Because if you got a serial rapist and you catch him the first time or the second time, then you prevent the other crimes, you prevent those investigations, and obviously you save victims having to go through this type of violence or possible homicides. Katie's Law, it's called Katie's Law because of Katie Sepich, who was murdered down in New Mexico. Jan Sepich, her mother, helped us. She came to Colorado, and she helped us get this through in Colorado. Go ahead. Let's skip this one. So the United States Supreme Court this year ruled on the constitutionality, in this case, of taking DNA upon arrest. Mr. King's DNA was taken upon arrest in 2009. There was a hit back to a 2003 case. The Maryland Supreme Court found a violation of the Fourth Amendment, said it was unconstitutional to take Mr. King's DNA upon arrest. You had to wait till he was convicted. The United States Supreme Court disagreed. You can skip the next one, too. You can skip that one. And so we've had Katie's Law in Colorado since 2010. The one thing I can tell you, I've gone up to the legislature now and gotten the law in Colorado changed 3 times. And Katie's Law was probably the most major thing that we did. We passed it in 2009, but we didn't have the money to start doing the DNA testing because there is a $7 fee on all speeding tickets and traffic tickets that goes towards taking this DNA testing. We had to wait till that fund got big enough to start the work. Plus the lab needed to do buy some additional equipment and things. In 2010 we started. We've had over 600 hits since 2010. Just in Denver alone, we've had 230 hits. We've solved 4 murders, and we've solved, I think it's over 30 rapes, 35 sexual assaults. And again, the key is you get your DNA up front, you match those cases, and then as far as the defense is concerned, obviously they don't like getting caught. But if you think about it practically, if I have arrested somebody and charged them with a new case and their DNA goes in and it hits, then I can handle all those cases at the same time. So for the judicial system, there is a degree of savings there. The other thing I'll tell you that what DNA does is that in our burglary project, we had hundreds and hundreds of cases. And I thought, great idea. All of my DAs will learn how to try DNA cases in burglaries as opposed to waiting for rapes and murders. None of them went to trial. The only ones that went to trial were the ones that we said, you're going to trial, like Mr. Davis. The court appearance on average was 2 times. Came in, told what their charges was, at preliminary hearing, agreed to plead to the charge because they were habitual criminals who were looking at 48 years in the penitentiary, and our average sentence was about 11 to 14 years. If you do the math, you plead guilty, you don't mess with us, and you don't end up with a 48-year sentence. And that's what happened with the majority of the guys in our burglary project. So I failed in that regard because none of them learned how to try DNA cases in burglaries. But making them plead to the charge when they're habitual criminals led to our reduction of crime in Denver over an 8-year period. We tried a misdemeanor law this year, didn't pass. Go ahead to the next one. But this is why. And if you look at this statistic, in New York City, they've been taking DNA upon misdemeanor conviction, not arrest, conviction. Conviction was always the magic line before the Maryland case. And if you look, shoplifters, they call it petite theft. Look, in 5 years, they've been taking DNA on petite theft. Shoplifters, those kinds of guys. They have solved 965 cases, and of those cases, 51 of them are murder cases, and 222 of them are sex assault cases. And then there's a whole list of other violent crimes. So, these guys are criminals. They'll pickpocket you. They'll go down here to the store and steal some candy, that type of thing. And when they get convicted in New York, they go into the database. They had 5 rapes they solved when 4 different rapists jumped to get into their system, didn't pay for transit. They jumped the, whatever they call those, the turnstiles. We don't have turnstile. We don't have much mass transit here in Colorado. But when they jumped over the turnstiles and got caught and convicted, they solved rapes. That's why I thought it was important that we expand our DNA database in Colorado to include misdemeanors. Go ahead. And then I'm going to talk to you lastly. How much time do I have left?
As much as you want.
Okay.
Really.
You guys need lunch, though, right? Familial DNA searching. This is something that they have done in the UK for years and wouldn't do in the United States, but we changed that. Go ahead. One more.
Morrissey thinks the U.S. should do what the Brits are doing. They have developed a technique to scour their DNA database, deliberately searching for partial matches that might indicate a relative. It's called familial searching. and the city of Rotherham used it to try and catch a criminal who had eluded police for 20 years. Back in the 1980s, he was called the shoe rapist because of the pattern of his attacks.
It was a lone female walking home. Invariably, they were wearing stiletto shoes. They were tied up using stockings, and their shoes were always stolen.
Detective Sue Hickman was given a list of 43 people in the area who could have been related to the rapist. The third door she knocked on belonged to June Lloyd, whose DNA was in the database because of a DUI arrest.
What did you say to her? We're running a cold case investigation, and there are some similarities between your DNA and the offender's DNA. Do you mind telling me, have you got any brothers? And she said, yes. She said, I've got a brother, but it won't be my brother, he's a businessman.
Her brother James was a manager at this print shop. Married with children, he had no criminal record. But when his sister called and told him about Hickman's visit, he became suicidal, and his family called the police. Underneath a trap door at his office, police discovered this.
Oh my goodness.
More than 100 women's shoes.
This is stunning.
All worn, all different sizes, all stiletto heels. DNA testing confirmed James Lloyd was the shoe rapist.
You visited 3 people and solved the crime in 8 hours. In 8 hours,
Go ahead.
You think this should be a national policy, familial searching?
Absolutely. There should be a familial searching policy that is constitutional and legal in the United States.
Go ahead. And this is really why I believe that. Go ahead, please. 210 specific serious criminal investigations done in the UK. About 19% of the time, they get a hit. They've gotten a hit. So the person, that DNA they have from the crime scene, they find a relative on their list. They do it a little differently than we do it, but that's a pretty good statistic. This is the list of perpetrators that they've caught. The black and white ones, there's 2 black and white pictures, are guys that they dug up and took samples from to show that their DNA matched. Mr. Cappan, the one that's up on the left side, second one down, murdered 3 girls in the 1970s. And they dug him up after getting a familial search to a match to his son. The one thing that they claim, the opponents of this, is that this is genetic surveillance of people of color. The United States database has an overrepresentation of people of color in it because our justice system has an overrepresentation of people of color in it. And the Brits have exactly the same thing. They have an overrepresentation of people of color in their criminal justice system. About 1/3 of all young black-skinned, they're not African American, but blacks in the UK are in their DNA database. Look at the people they've caught with familial searching. They can study this stuff forever. These are old fat white guys that never get in the criminal justice system. They don't even get speeding tickets or DUIs like Mr. Lloyd's sister got. But they're able to rape and murder people. Some of these guys murder people and cut them up, and that have been caught through this. And so when my opponents to this, I always like showing this slide because, you'll put the African Americans in the United States under genetic surveillance. Well, one thing I'll tell you, every victim of Lonnie Franklin's in South Central Los Angeles was an African American woman. And those families deserve answers, just like these families got answers. And that's usually my response to that criticism. Go ahead. So 88 serious crimes charged in the UK. Go ahead. Skip this one. Skip this one. So we went to the UK in 2006. In fact, I met with the consulate here in this building. We had lunch. He said, is there anything we can do to build a bridge with Denver? I said, yeah, we'd like to learn about your forensics. And they set up a trip. We were able to go over there, the head of our lab and the head of our crimes against persons and myself. And the reason I wanted to go was learn about familial searching because they had a whole protocol and we learned about that. We came back We suggested to the FBI that they start researching familial searching in the United States. They weren't interested. And usually what happens in Denver when people aren't interested, like when they built the transcontinental train and went through Wyoming, we built a train line from Denver to that train so Denver wouldn't be left out. When the FBI told us they weren't interested, when places like California, Texas told us they weren't interested, we did our own research to show that it worked in the United States. And in the process, we developed a familial search software that we give away to any state or any place in the world, in any state that will use it in a legal and constitutional way. So we've given it to 8 states and to 1 city in California. We've also given it to the Australians. One thing about the Australians, they understand what free means. And so we have given it to 2 states and to their national DNA database, and they're in the process of validating it. We have offered it to 28 other states in the United States and been turned down. Why, I don't have any idea. It's worth about $100,000, and we give it to anybody that will use it properly. Go ahead. We actually dealt with, I got to tell you this, and this, I don't have, but I got to meet Governor Jerry Brown. Governor Jerry Brown was one of those guys when I was growing up. He was governor. His girlfriend was a rock star. Moonbeam Brown. He became the mayor of Oakland. Well, on his rise back to being governor, he was the attorney general of the state of California. And California refused to do familial searching. And I was sent out to Los Angeles to do this presentation, and I played that very clip from the UK. And I said, Jerry Brown won't change his policy and give us information in Denver that we need to maybe solve a case where a woman was raped and beaten and lost the sight in her eye. And he won't change his policy. And you would think he'd care about victims like Lonnie Franklin's victims, and they've since caught a serial rapist in Sacramento. They solved another old murder case where the murderer is actually dead. And they have the first United States rape conviction in the United States based on changing this policy. But it had nothing to do with victims. When I was done talking, 200 or so Los Angeles union law enforcement, one of the union reps came up to me and said, listen, will you help me draft a letter to Mr. Brown indicating that we will never give him another dime in contributions for anything he ever runs for again if he doesn't change this policy? He said, sure. I mean, I'm an elected official. I know how that works, right? So we wrote the letter, and in 2 weeks I got a call with a very nice invite to come to California and help us change our familial search policy. And now Jerry Brown is governor of the state of California. I guess all ends well, right? But what we do to protect people's rights is when we get that match, potential likelihood ratio, we don't end there, because remember, these are men, mostly. And the matches, the familial matches that we get to in the United States are mostly men. And I told you about that Y chromosome test, right? So if our software is telling us that there's a 95% chance these folks are brothers, they're going to have the same Y chromosome type. We don't need to know the guy's name in the database. All we need is a sample to run the Y chromosome type. And if they don't match, we don't care, right? It's not our guy. But if they match, then we get the name and do a conventional investigation. And that way, we protect innocent people in the database. They're there because they've committed crimes, but they're innocent. We know they didn't commit our crime, and we know also they're not the brother or the father of that individual. Go ahead. This is one of our research projects. The same thing was a burglary case. We had DNA on an earpiece. And we got a 90% chance that this individual, go ahead, was the father of who left the DNA in our database. I have blocked out his name, but clearly he's not innocent. He's serving, I think, a 96-year sentence out of my jurisdiction for attempted murder. Go ahead. That's the woman he attempted to murder. We created the family tree once we had confirmed that we did have the same Y chromosome type. So now we're looking for his sons. The girls drop out. They don't have, we were looking for males, so go ahead. First male, First son, he was in prison at the time of our burglary, so he had a good alibi. He may have been sharing a cell with his brother, who also was in prison at the time of our burglary, and they both had the same alibi. The third son was not in prison at the time of our burglary, but was in prison at the time of our investigation. So what does that mean? If he's in prison before they changed our statute to take DNA upon arrest, I told you that if they were in prison, we should have their DNA in our database. We had no match. So we called the penitentiary and said, hey, what's the deal? They said, well, we got a backlog. Well, could you move him up a little? And they said, sure. And in 2 weeks, we had a hit to the burglary, the DNA. So the software was right. The testing was good. We've done it now a dozen times, and we've been able to get to the DNA, the person that left the DNA at the crime scene, through a familial search. Go ahead through this stuff. This is to fact. This just shows you how to do this. And go ahead. So 10 separate occasions. I think we're up to 12 now. That shows you the costs. Go ahead, one more. Cost us about, the only cost is running the YSDR test. Remember, you're talking about a major investigation. You've got cops that are running down every lead they possibly get. So this is only going to save them money. This is a lead that's based on science that you're giving them. And they love to run these down. The only cost is running that Y test, that Y chromosome test, to determine if they are in fact male relatives. Go ahead. And this is the case that resulted in the first conviction in the United States using familial searching. It came out of our research project, and it's actually a guy that broke into 60 cars, cut himself and bled in the car. And we were able to catch him because his brother's a car thief and was in our DNA database. We do not use this technique for car break-ins usually. But because we were doing research, we wanted to do all our forensic unknowns, which included property crimes, against our state database. And that's how we came up with this guy. And, as a prosecutor, I figured we should hold him accountable. So we went ahead and pled. He went ahead and charged him, got his sample through a warrant, charged him, and he came to court and pled guilty to these car break-ins, and I think he got probation. Something like that. But this, in the United States, this was the first conviction. The only other conviction through familial searching so far is that rape case I told you about in California, but it came after ours. You can go through this. And like I say, we've offered it to 28, 27 states. I think Oregon I offered it to them last week. So, and this is really the end of it. So why is DNA important? And if you go, you can see that it is expensive to have a DNA database. Like I told you, the first time we did DNA in Denver, it cost us about $5,000 to do the testing. It now costs $40. So $40 a piece. The United States spends about $3.5 million on the database, and you can see the billions of dollars that have been prevented in new crimes based on using DNA and that database. Go ahead. And, it just shows you that if you are in the business of cost-effective law enforcement, there is no more cost-effective way to take violent criminals off your streets than to use DNA to do that. The sad thing is that we have a lot of cold cases where there is no DNA. And we can't give those families answers. And oftentimes in sex assaults, we don't have DNA. But the good news is that this database is working. It's become cheaper. It's become faster. And in the future, it's going to become even faster. We're now looking at rapid DNA, where we can get a DNA profile in 70 to 90 minutes. Depending on how quickly you need it, that's very important. Although if you're doing 200 at a time, that's still probably more cost effective. So it's getting faster, it's getting better, and the key to it is it's scientifically based. It allows us to exonerate innocent people. When I talked to you about Mr. Lawless, The easiest way to exonerate somebody for all those rapes was to ask for a DNA sample. We exonerated over 200 men in the course of that investigation. And when their DNA didn't match, we didn't have to worry about where they were for the first 5 rapes or anything like that. That ended it, and we moved on. So when the girlfriend called and said, that composite drawing looks an awful lot like my ex-boyfriend, you better go talk to him. Well, we ran that lead down, I guarantee you. Asked him for a sample, ran the sample sometimes in a matter of days, exonerated him, said thank you for the DNA, and kept working. And you keep working and keep looking. And this helps you sort those people out, exonerate those people, and move forward. So it's extremely cost effective. And I've always considered myself just lucky enough that in 1987, I picked up that file, and it resulted in me going down this road as far as DNA is concerned. Got a lot more gray hair than I had at that time, but I'll tell you, to see this become what it has become in a mere 25 years in law enforcement, it's incredible. If you have any questions, I'll answer them. If you guys want to go to lunch, don't worry, I understand. Yes?
I was kind of curious. I mean, you mentioned some of these people who were convicted for 48 years, which of course means they get out in about 35 or something, but do they then go out and commit more rapes?
Well, with the rapists, it's a little bit different. Sometimes with just property offenders, even more violent criminals like guys that pull stick-ups and stuff, you can age them out of committing those kinds of crimes. Just naturally, as they get older, when they get out, they're just tired of being in the penitentiary, that kind of thing. But rapists are a different type of predator. And oftentimes, we'll see, especially people that perpetrate on children, they don't seem to age out of that. I guess, at some point they'll age out of it, but that'll just be a biological, physical thing. But their urges and their, I have one pretty graphic example I could tell you about, but an individual was caught with DNA sexually assaulting and murdering women who had been castrated by a group of individuals that didn't like the fact that he had raped a young girl in an Arkansas town. So they rounded him up and castrated him. He eventually ended up in prison. He got out, and his DNA was found under the fingernails of 2 women that were sexually assaulted and murdered in Missouri after he paroled out of the Arkansas jail. So rapists are a little different. Yes?
By the way, I'm from Arkansas. So,
okay. You know the case I'm talking about.
Yes, I do. Is it a fair assumption that prior to DNA testing, that the main focus of law enforcement was to find enough evidence to convince a jury rather than necessarily find the truth, since they knew they probably could not find definite evidence?
Well, there's 2 things that go on. If you saw that thing that showed our statistics on cold case, we have 200 cases we've solved, but we've only been able to bring 102 cases. So we were able to give answers to families and to rape victims over 200 times because we know the individual that did that. We have one individual, I tried him in the 80s. He got convicted of 3 murders. We have solved 5, 6 murders that he was responsible for through our cold case work. We're able to tell those families. Some of them said, well, we knew that. He was the last one to see her alive, that type of thing. But we've had a couple, and in that case, a lady in a completely different part of town found dead in her bathtub, had been in Denver only about a month, worked at a bank, wasn't a prostitute, that type of a deal. Boom, up he came there. And when we told that family, we answered questions that they'd had to live with for years. And one of them was, did her boyfriend kill her? And the guy that had to live with that family believing he had murdered their daughter for 20 some odd years. I had to live with that. The first thing the son said when we had the meeting with him, we owe somebody an apology. So you're right. When you get to the truth, you can't always bring the charges. Mr. Groves is dead. If we could dig him up and try him for all these murders, it'd probably get criticized for that, for wasting money. But we can go to those families and we can tell them, listen, we know who killed your daughter. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wondered if you had any commentary on how not to run a lab. In my state of Michigan, an employee at the Michigan State Police lab compromised hundreds of cases which had to be re-examined. And then there's the city of Detroit, and I don't need to say any more after that. So we've had some real issues.
Well, you want a commentary from me?
Well, how do you protect your own lab?
I get told that things like this now, no political statements. And then I have somebody ask me a question like,
how do you apply those lessons to your lab days?
You work so hard to convict these guys and put them in prison. How do you feel about the governor letting them all out? The governor at the time was my former boss, so, I was all right. But the Detroit situation was basically when Detroit went bankrupt, they just closed their crime lab and abandoned it. Some of the other problems that Michigan's had, not really their doing. They had a fire in one of their state labs. So a board that I'm on out of Tampa, we sent them labs that we built for Afghanistan that the military gave back to us so they could continue to do some of their forensic work. What you need to do in this business is make sure you have competent people that are proficient in doing their testing, that are honest and won't lie about, like the FBI had a woman that wasn't running the tests right because she didn't want to make it look like she wasn't proficient. So she wasn't using one of the reagent blanks that you need to do to show that there is no contamination in your reagents when you're doing the amplification. And you have to have certified labs. So what do we do in Denver? We have 100% ISO accreditation for every unit in the Denver Police Department crime lab. That includes the guys that lift the evidence up off the street, all the way through all of the DNA people. But our fingerprint people, our ballistics people, everybody in our crime lab has ISO accreditation. Proficiency tests, those types of things. The interesting thing about the federal government is they tend to give money to places that fail disastrously. And New Orleans is an example of that, partially due to a storm that they didn't have any control over, and Detroit is also. The good news is what the Detroit people have done with their money is their cold case program is starting to rival ours. They're up around 25 cases that they've solved because they walked into a lab that was virtually abandoned with rape kits that police had already sent to them saying, we want a profile out of this. And they've gone through those, thousands of them, and run them. And the last I saw was about 20, 25 rape cases that they've been able to solve. So, the Michigan State Lab, and I can't comment on the woman, but anytime you have to go back and review, anytime you find contamination, you've got to make sure you do that. Because you cannot have a lab that's compromised. And once you do have a lab that's compromised, it takes you decades to dig out of it. Just ask them down in Houston. Yes, sir.
We're 20 minutes at overtime.
I can answer your questions offline.
Is it okay if I send you to lunch right now, or do you have something really important, Kevin?
Something I think very important. Which is
Okay.
A lot of serial killers and serial rapists, and it's well known that the average child molester has from dozens to hundreds of victims. Why do we ever release sexual predators from prison?
Well, in Colorado, we never stop supervising. We have lifetime supervision for sex offenders. If they'll register when they're out, and sometimes they don't, we round them up for that. A lot of the sex offenders that you're talking about on children and on women under our system get such long floor sentences. You saw that, 90 years to life.
That's good.
And that's the type of sentences we get. But I got to tell you, we handle a lot of child molesters that get 5 years to life. And they're coming back out. And the question is, what do you do with them when they get back out? And the one thing I always say is make sure you at least have their DNA. The problem with child molesters is they tend to groom their victims. They tend to know their victims. And DNA doesn't necessarily help you a lot in those types of situations. Unless somebody kept an item that has DNA on it, kind of like President Clinton's situation, something along those lines, then, DNA doesn't help you a lot. One more, sir. You're the last one.
I was a DA in South Central LA in the 70s, deputy DA. And this is before, obviously, any DNA. How does your office handle the fact now that juries expect DNA? Because you must have crimes where you don't have it, but you're sure you got the perpetrator. And how does your office review cases to make sure they get to trial, given the obsession with conviction rates that a lot of deputy DAs have?
Well, I got to tell you, our conviction rate is extremely high. And it's not something you really have to worry about much, because if you make the appropriate offer in the case, you get a conviction. It may not be a conviction to the charge. But what I do when I pick a jury, and everybody says you're like the DA, you don't do that very often, but about once a year, I get to pick the case I try. So it always involves this stuff. And I always say, are there any fans of CSI here? And if people raise their hand, I'll say, now you realize that that's fiction, right? You realize that we don't do things and you don't solve crimes like this in an hour. That it requires, and I talk to them about that. And if I have somebody that is just obsessed with CSI, they're gone. And I always do I'm going to call scientists, and they don't look anything like what you see on TV, and everybody laughs, that kind of thing. But the reason I do it is try to weed out the people that are going to come back and say, or the jury that's going to come back and say, you left that one woman on, and they always blame you. And she just said, well, I saw it on CSI. I know they could have done this testing. I know they could have done that. And, it's true that jurors do expect DNA, and when you don't have it, they question why. And the other thing that you're talking about is the obsession with prosecutors. Is prosecutors will waste your crime lab's resources chasing DNA that doesn't exist to show that we tried. There was a time when you didn't have evidence, it was irrelevant. But now, I've had DNA, fingerprints, identification, all of that. Too much is never enough when you're trying a case. But it has added an element that we have to take into account. And then I always have young prosecutors that come back and say, oh, they found him not guilty because we didn't have DNA on the bag of the cocaine that was in the guy's mouth. Yeah, we could do that, but we're not going to. We can't afford to run those kinds of tests. So that's the phenomenon we see. Thank you all for having me. Spend as much money as you have here. It helps our economy, and the mayor always tells me to suggest that.
Thank you very much.